We've been waiting to see Elbaf since even before the turn of the millennia, but thanks to Dr. Vegapunk, we know that our log poses are finally pointing there. So that's why I want to take a deep dive into the seemingly endless reasons to be excited about this arc, like how we might learn about Shanks' connections to this island, how Usopp becomes a brave warrior of the sea, whether Big Mom's history with the Giants comes full circle even though she's missing in action right now, and what's Oda cooking up with Prince Loki, who shares his name with the famous trickster god, or god of mischief, from Norse mythology, which likely serves as a lot of the inspiration for Elbaf in the first place. It also seems all but confirmed that the Atom Tree resides here as well because of the tree we saw in the background. But Frankie even mentioned how the Atom Tree was found in a land with never-ending wars, and that seems pretty accurate for Elbaf, which has also been dubbed Warland several times now. And believe it or not, I think there's even a role for Eustass Kid to play here as well. And look, I know he's a hard character to defend at this point, but the fact of the matter is, he's credited with defeating Big Mom, who is public enemy number 1 to the Giants. We probably all remember Big Mom's rampage back in the day, but all of Elbaf even heard about what she did to Mother Carmel and the children, and they also began to despise her even more after Lola stood up Loki at their wedding. So the fact that Kid took down Big Mom probably has to come into play at some point. But to be fair, we are in the final saga, so there's only so much time left in the story. And with all the other plot lines likely to develop during this arc, as well as around the world, I think this just makes sense as the place where the final war truly begins, or what the Giants would likely call Ragnarok. And that's why I actually want to start by talking about why this arc is where we will find our final ancient weapon, Uranus. But first, make sure to go hit like and subscribe to the channel because we are just under the pace to hit 50k subs by the end of the year, and literally every single one's going to make a difference. The reason I want to start with Uranus is because it also helps us explain just how important this arc is, why it will likely be a longer arc, and it's just a good chance to kind of give an overview, because I see Elbaf as one of the big 3. Now that's not an official term or anything, I kind of made it up, but these are the 3 arcs that have had more foreshadowing as a place for us to visit than any other, and these are Fishman Island, Wano, and Elbaf. Other than Laugh Tale, of course, there are no locations that have had the same build-up that these 3 have had, which is why Fishman Island had Poseidon, Wano had Pluton, and as I mentioned, Elbaf is where we will find Uranus. So let me explain why these 3 are the big 3. So Fishman Island was actually the first one mentioned out of these 3 way back in chapter 68 during the Baratie, and then we spent basically the last third of the pre-time skip trying to get there before taking detours at Thriller Bark, then Sabaody, which had Kuma separate the crew across the world, then we had Impel Down, Marineford, and even 3D2Y before our crew finally made it down there. It had so much build-up throughout the story, you just knew we were going to get there eventually. And of course, it's even where they eventually found their first ancient weapon, Poseidon. And then while Wano was technically mentioned last of these 3 by Hogback of all people back in chapter 450, it was kind of also revealed first because of Oda's one-shot called Monsters that debuted in 1994, 3 years before One Piece did. It featured a young Ryuma, who's from Wano, slaying a massive dragon to save a small town, which is obviously a bit of foreshadowing to Wano being controlled by Kaido, who has dragon powers in the real story. And Oda basically confirmed that Monsters is canon as well, because in SBS 47 he said that Ryuma in Thriller Bark was the very same one as the one in Monsters, and then later in that very same SBS answer, he said that the Garp from another one-shot called Romance Dawn should be considered from another story entirely. So it kind of tells us that Monsters is in fact canon, at least to some degree, and it's also receiving a new animation soon, which only kind of adds on to that fact. But the point here is that Wano has always been on Oda's mind. I mean, that's why he chose it to be the Japan-themed island, essentially. And it took us 10 real-life years to get through the Straw Hat Heart Pirates Alliance goal of getting to Wano and taking down Kaido. We had to go defeat Caesar and Doflamingo first, rendezvous at Zou, and then get Sanji at Whole Cake, and then we spent 4 entire real-life years in Wano, which is still the longest arc in the story now by a decent margin. And while they didn't see Pluton, they did learn that that ancient weapon is underneath it. And I think Elbaf fills a very similar role to both Fishman Island and Wano because it was also name-dropped very early, way back in chapter 116 during Little Garden. And while I can't see it being as long as Wano because the entire story might not be that long at this point, it's going to still fill a very similar role in regards to learning about the past, the ancient kingdom, and the ancient weapons. For example, we know Saul is still alive, so Robin meeting him seems like a foregone conclusion, but it's not just for the emotional gratification. Oda set this up because Saul also studied the books left behind from the Fallen Tree of Knowledge at Ohara, along with the other Elbaf giants, so Robin meeting up with him could serve as a chance to learn new information. And as I mentioned earlier, it seems safe to assume that this island is where the Atom Tree tree resides, which probably has some relation to the Sunlight Tree Eve above Fishman Island. Adam is also where Frankie got the wood to build the Sunny, and Tom got the wood for the Oro Jackson. Frankie claimed it was the world's strongest tree, and again, it was in a land with never-ending wars. And if Dory and Bragi were any indication, then a never-ending war happening on Elbaf seems very possible since they fought each other for 100 years. Frankie also mentioned how the tree never fell despite all of those wars, and even if the island was in ruins, people would come back to the tree and rebuild. I think this could also tie to Ohara, where the Tree of Knowledge fell after 5,000 years of existence, because who were the ones that returned to that area to save the books? Giants from Elbaf. And even Saul, who we have to remember isn't from Elbaf and doesn't actually like the Elbaf giants all that much. He once told Robin not to lump him in with those savages, but he did seem to put aside those differences to get those books from Ohara. So all of that could be its own important factor during the arc as well. And as I mentioned, Elbaf is also going to be heavily inspired by Norse mythology, which we already know not only because of Loki, but also their general Viking aesthetic, and even Shanks' ship having its own Viking figurehead, which likely means the Adam Tree would then be a parallel to Yggdrasil, otherwise known as the World Tree, which was said to be big enough to connect the 9 worlds, including the underworld, earth, and land of the gods. It was even said that around this tree existed all else, and only Ragnarok was enough to really bring serious harm to this tree. And like I said earlier, Fishman Island had Poseidon, Wano had Pluton, leaving only Uranus, the god of the sky, as the ancient weapon we have yet to find. So perhaps Uranus is sitting on top of that tree waiting for the one who commands it. Or maybe the tree needs to fall over first for Uranus to come down. I'll get back to all those ideas towards the end when I discuss Vivi, but Uranus's introduction to the story could be a catalyst for the start of the final war, especially now that we've seen what the Mother Flame can do. We don't know exactly what Uranus's abilities are just yet. We actually don't know that much about it at all, but a giant hole like this coming from something in the sky just feels like a god of the sky kind of thing to do. And that could maybe be how the hole at Enni's lobby was made in the first place, because that one's a lot older. And this could really illustrate why Uranus's return would help kick off the final war, or again, what the giants would probably just call Ragnarok. One key difference between these two holes though is that Lelucia is still dark and stormy, while Enni's lobby is famously daytime 24/7, even being called Never Night Island. So I've always wondered how people manage to get any sleep there. They'd probably need an adjustable high quality sleep mask with 100% blackout, like one from the sponsor for today's video, mantasleep. I don't know about you, but I cherish my sleep. So I've been trying to improve it with new pillows, bedding, and even sunrise alarms, but nothing has offered the same type of improvement as my mantasleep mask. This thing would probably even get Blackbeard to fall asleep. It's so light and comfortable that you can barely even tell it's there. It also comes with an infinitely adjustable fit and soft, durable materials that will help you up your nap game at pretty much any time of the day. There's even a few different masks to choose from. You have the Manta Cool mask, which soothes your eyes and sinuses, the Steam mask, which can alleviate stress and dry eyes in just 3 to 5 minutes, the Manta Weighted mask and Silk mask, if those are more your thing, and even the Manta Sleep Mask Pro, which is probably my favorite because it's perfect for side sleepers like me. And you can even upgrade that to the Sleep Mask Sound, which I also really enjoyed because it even comes with adjustable razor-thin headphones that last for over 20 hours, twice their leading competitor. So if you want to join the pro nap movement, then check out the Manta Sleep website and enjoy 10% off your first order by using my discount code in the description. So thanks again to mantasleep for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. Now, one big difference between these big 3 arcs is that Fishman Island and Wano were announced as destinations years in advance, and we didn't hear Elbaf mentioned explicitly until Vegapunk in chapter 1090. But I think we actually knew Elbaf was coming since the end of Wano, when Luffy, Law, and Kid decided what islands they were going to next, because Luffy and Kid had to draw straws to decide where each of them were going, and Luffy got the shorter straw, which took them to Egghead. And because Elbaf is in the appropriate direction towards the end of the New World, and thus Lodestar Island from Egghead Island, I think we kind of knew we were always going to go there, or at least that direction. And if Kid had just pulled the shorter straw back then, our crew would already be there, which actually opens a really fun what-if scenario, because Luffy would have met Shanks already then, and Kid would have been at Egghead, which is a better fit for him, since he was seen to be kind of an engineer as a child. And he also uses Punk in all of his attack names, which is meant to be more of a punk rock rock kind of thing, but it could also tie to Vegapunk. Kid's railgun also has 07 on the side, which is kinda interesting when you consider Vegapunk only had 6 satellites. Is Oda hinting that there's some connection between him and Vegapunk, and could that maybe be covered within Elbaf if the Stella makes it there? Speaking of Egghead though, you've probably noticed all of the parallels already between the events there and Sabaody, like all the pacifistas, Sentomaru being involved, Kizaru pulling up, and even Kuma being a focal point through his memories and Bonnie, as well as some other factors. And the reason that's important is thanks to Kuma, Sabaody led us right into Amazon Lily, and then the Summit War, which might tell us a thing or two about what to expect from Elbaf since it's likely to follow Egghead. And while Amazon Lily was a very quick arc, it revealed a lot of things that are becoming important in the final saga right now. The first of which is the ability to turn people to stone, which is an ability Blackbeard was just pursuing, and that Vegapunk duplicated with S-Snake at Egghead, and in a story about reading a bunch of important stones, that power might matter more than we think. But the more important connection for Elbaf is that Amazon Lily is what kickstarted Luffy's involvement in the Summit War, when he learned that Ace is set to be executed, which caused him to look at the Weaver card, which almost vanished by that point, so he knew he had to do something. So Luffy then infiltrated Impel Down with Boa's help, and that cascaded into the massive war we know as Marineford. And I think, at least generally speaking, Elbaf could do something similar, where Luffy gets some kind of necessary motivation to take on the government in this final war. Like maybe Vivi shares the information about what happened at the Reverie, or she just gets captured, the Mother Flame wipes out one of his friend's islands, or maybe Elbaf just has some important history that helps tie things together. Amazon Lily is also where we learned about the cruelty of the Celestial Dragons through Boa's flashback as a slave, so maybe we get some more lore about the Void Century somehow this time too. I mean, remember, Saul and the other giants just visited Ohara. And a lot of people have already made the connection between the two Lilies, being Nefertari Lily and Amazon Lily, and while I'm not sure what the full direct connection between those two is, if there is one, I do think it's a hint that Vivi will be involved in Elbaf. I mean, she was already with our crew when we first heard of Elbaf back in chapter 116, so it would also be fitting in that sense. But no matter what, I just think all signs are pointing that this is where the final war will begin. So in order to talk about how that happens, let's discuss the major players in the arc as well as the plot itself. And I think the most important person to start with is actually Loki, the Prince of Elbaf. He technically should be filling the role of the Momo, the Rebecca, the Vivi, basically the prince or princess of an island who needs our help. That has kind of been Oda's tried and true formula for all of his major story arcs. The heir to the throne in most arcs becomes our ally rather quickly, and that's who ends up giving us the motivation to help their people in some kind of way. But I think Loki might be a bit different. Not that he would be evil, of course, but I can see him almost as more of an anti-hero, or at least someone who is against the way Elbaf is right now. And the first reason for that is because of the Loki in Norse mythology, who is a trickster god, or the god of mischief. He's not necessarily good nor evil, he's just very chaotic, and usually misguides people in some kind of way. He's almost a little like Usopp in that regard, actually, which I don't think that's an accident on Oda's part. And I know this is just a silhouette, but Loki and Usopp's hair even look kinda similar. So I think these two characters are going to have a very important connection during this arc. Like where Usopp is not a giant, but loves the way Elbaf giants live their lives, Loki may be the future king of the giants who hates the way Elbaf giants live their lives. He may not like their reputation as savages, even though Usopp views their lifestyle in a positive way. And I actually think there's reason to believe that Loki will share similarities to another heir to the throne that we've met before, being Kazuki Odin. Not to be confused with the other Odin, another very important god in Norse mythology alongside Loki, but Odin. I kinda pronounce them the same, so forgive me, but you know what I mean. Odin was a frustrating prince for the Kazuki family because he wanted to open the borders. And while he definitely wasn't an evil person, he was constantly getting into trouble and eventually was even kicked out of his family. I mean, he was introduced eating food on his friend's burning corpse. He also always wanted to leave Wano even though nobody was supposed to. He didn't like the status quo there because he wanted the borders to be opened and see the world. It wasn't until he left and came back that he learned why things are the way they are. And when Momo had the choice to destroy those borders after Kaido was defeated, he decided not to, probably because of what he read in Odin's journal. There was probably a lot for Odin to learn about the world from his very naive beginnings, and that experience changed his perspective on the country of Wano. I mean, he knew that a certain figure would come and save them in the future, and I think Loki might mirror that a little bit by being like Odin before the journeys, by disliking the way things are in Elbaf for one reason or another, and wanting to change that and go on his own adventures. This is actually the same kind of vibe we get from Shirahoshi, but just in a different way, and that's important because, like I mentioned before, Fishman Island, Wano, and Elbaf are all kind of the big three arcs. abuse. So I think the heirs to the throne in all three are also going to be kind of similar, because Shirahoshi was literally stuck in her room for years because of Vanderdecken, while her goal was to go to the surface and see the sun and a real forest. She also wants to carry out her mom's wish of moving all of the fishmen to the surface, almost opening their borders just like Odin wanted to do with Wano, but in a very different way with very different solutions, all while wishing to see what the world has to offer themselves. And I think Loki will have a very similar goal, making Elbaf a more approachable and civilized country that people can leave and visit as they please. But the thing with Loki in Norse mythology is that he was actually tied up and tortured until Ragnarok as punishment for his role in Baldur's demise. Everybody loved Baldur, and he was even immune from harm except for one thing, which was mistletoe, and Loki revealed that to somebody who ended up shooting Baldur with an arrow and killing him. Everybody was really sad about this, so Hel said she would resurrect Baldur as long as everybody on Earth wished for his return. And everybody did so except for one old woman, who actually ended up being Loki in disguise. So Baldur did not end up coming back to life, despite 99.99% of people wanting that to happen. So as punishment, Loki was eventually tied up and basically had venom dripped on him for forever, basically, only to be freed once Ragnarok happens, at which point Loki wanted to seek revenge. So while I doubt the One Piece Loki has done anything drastic enough to face that very same fate, I think Oda's still gonna parallel it by having Loki be stuck on the island of Elbaf, kind of like Odin was stuck in Wano and Shirahoshi was stuck in her room in Fishman Island. And Loki may not be allowed to leave until Ragnarok happens. Loki probably wants to go see the world just like the rest of the giants are right now, which raises the question of why would he be punished, or why would he be forced to stay in Elbaf in the first place? Well, I think one important layer to this is that he may be the only heir to the throne, and because of the Lola situation, he probably hasn't had any children yet, and thus the giants just can't risk him dying, getting lost, captured, etc. And I think there's actually evidence of this being the case as well, because when Lola stood him up at their wedding, he was actually offered Chiffon as a replacement, literally Lola's identical twin, but Loki refused, only wanting Lola. If Loki didn't take the girl's literal identical twin, then I doubt he's gonna go marry someone else either. The giants need him to stay alive and reproduce at some point, so that's probably one reason why he's stuck there and doesn't get to adventure like all the other giant pirates. But to build onto this, in chapter 866, during Big Mom's flashback, the Elbaf giants actually toast to Loki's birth at the castle during the winter solstice, thus hinting at how important his birth may have been. They also mention Rode and Goldberg being born in the village at the same time, which is kinda cool because those are now the navigator and cook of the new giant warrior pirates. And while we don't actually know a ton about the royalty of the giants, we have learned a little about the giant warrior pirates at least, and we've seen that they're usually led by two people, like co-captains Yorl and Jarl back in the day, who referred to each other as battle companions, and then they were followed by Dory and Brogy. I also just mentioned Rode and Goldberg being born together as well, and we even saw Oimo and Kashi together for like 50 years before they were freed by Usopp and the crew at Eni's lobby. The giants are pretty consistently appearing in pairs, save for Hyrudine or Saul or giants like that, who have all ironically partnered with the Straw Hat crew in some way. So perhaps Loki not having a counterpart with him like the others is why he's important. Loki might be a loner both in terms of not being married, nor having a partner in crime or battle companion or whatever to fight and travel with. Maybe the reason the giants are usually found in pairs is because it's almost like a buddy system thing. So without Loki having a partner, he can't really go anywhere safely. And since Loki from actual Norse mythology and Usopp seem to have some parallels already, I wonder if there's a chance that Usopp is the one to become Loki's counterpart in some way. Maybe that's what helps Usopp become a brave warrior of the sea, by clashing with the literal prince or future king of Elbaf. And I think Loki's loner status could be a hint at what he wants to change about Elbaf. Just like Odin wanted to change the borders of Wano, I think Loki wants to stop Elbaf's constant wars. I don't think he sees the point in fighting for pride or for the god of Elbaf. Maybe that's the reason why he didn't want to marry another giant to begin with. Nor has he found a partner to battle with like Dorian Brogy. He doesn't really fit in with the giant's way of life, which stands out because being a tough, brave warrior is pretty much synonymous with being an Elbaf giant. That's why Usopp admires them so much, and even if you look at what Yorl and Jarl said back in the day, they basically told the young giants that they are warriors above all else, and commended Raideen on training Hyrudine so well even though he was so young. When we first heard of Elbaf, we met met Dorian Broggie, who fought every day for 100 years to please their gods and settle such a simple dispute. And as we've seen oh so many times in One Piece, gods don't even really exist. Think about Nolan killing the snake in Shandora, or Luffy taking down Enel. I even talked about that a lot more in this Gear 5th video, because Nika might be a similar thing for all we know. But the main point here is that whether it's a snake, Enel, the Celestial Dragons, Gonfall, or even the Gorosei, who are called warrior gods, God is just a title. So while we will surely learn more about the supposed gods of Elbaf during the Elbaf arc, I feel like there's a good chance Loki sees it for what it is and just despises that whole system. I mean, the one time we've seen Loki was just his silhouette before his failed wedding with Lola, and he was holding a flower. And that flower was the only thing that got actual color in the anime. I think this symbolism is trying to tell us that he is much gentler than most giants. He's probably not as rough around the edges like the others, which, to be fair, Elbaf giants don't really have the cleanest reputation already. While they were kind of glorified during Little Garden, I mentioned earlier how Saul didn't even want to be lumped in with the savages of Elbaf. He treated them like barbarians almost, and I think Loki might be the one who's trying to break that trend, thus also building a connection between Loki and Saul, which is pretty cool. Instead of constantly fighting for honor and pleasing gods that may not exist, I think Loki probably wants to drive the giants to be at least somewhat more civilized, and maybe this could even tie into why he isn't allowed to leave the country. Not only is he the last of the bloodline, he may not even want to keep the giants' traditions anyway. Even Luffy actually voiced his disdain for their culture once by asking if they'd really give up their lives just because the gods wanted them to. Perhaps Loki embodies this to the furthest degree, and being the prince of Elbaf and the rightful heir to the throne, he may feel as if that's his duty, which again is a beautiful inversion to Usopp, who wants nothing more than to immerse himself in the culture of Elbaf, and maybe even do so enough to become his own brave warrior of the sea. And that's a really interesting comparison to how Usopp views the samurai, because he didn't like their focus on pride, on dying in battle as some kind of responsibility, because Usopp is someone who clings to life no matter how embarrassing it is. While the cultures of Elbaf and Wano are definitely somewhat different, I think Elbaf does share somewhat similar values to Wano when it comes to battle at least, and maybe Usopp will have some kind of change of heart one way or another once he sees what being a warrior of Elbaf is really like. And if all of this is even roughly true and Loki really does want to go adventure out into the world at some point, whose ship would Loki even escape on? Very few people can sail a boat by themselves, and if Loki could have left another way already, then he probably would have. He's likely going to need to leave with somebody if adventuring is his goal. Now, maybe the Strawhats jump out at you as an obvious guess, which would definitely be pretty cool, but I think there's someone who actually makes a lot more sense, even though it does kind of pain me to say it, and that's Eustass Kid. I know a lot of you will think that is blasphemous.
That is blasphemous!
Especially since Kid's ship just got ripped in half by Dorian Broggie, so there's a legitimate question of how they're gonna leave themselves, but there's a few important things to consider. Like I said at the beginning, the giants hate Big Mom, and Kid is credited with defeating her. Say whatever you want about how Law did most of the work during the fight or whatever you want to say, but the news is the news, and the giants probably know he helped. Also, Loki probably dislikes Big Mom even more than most giants since he got stood up at the altar. I mean, yes, it was Lola's fault for turning him down, but Big Mom probably set that all up, promising him that Lola would marry him, so I can imagine he holds some kind of hatred for her too. So Kid beating Big Mom earns more brownie points with him than any other giant probably. And I think Kid and Loki almost have to talk about that at some point. So I think that if Loki has a chance to meet Kid, he's actually going to befriend him and want to help him. Yes, Kid wanted to harm Elbaf with his railgun before Shanks took care of business, but if Loki has issues with Elbaf anyway, then he probably wouldn't hold that against him. And earlier I mentioned all the potential ties between Loki and Odin, and how did Odin eventually get off the island? By riding with Whitebeard, who randomly crashed his ship at the shores of Wano. Odin was able to help him out, prove his strength, and ultimately, but barely, earned a spot on the crew so he could go see the world. And coincidentally, Loki also just had his own notorious pirate crash his ship at the shores of Elbaf, being Eustass Kid. If they befriend each other during the arc, then maybe that's how Loki leaves and how Kid's crew can get relevant again. I mean, remember, the Atom Tree might be on this island, so Kid getting a new ship or a repaired ship is totally on the table. Now, comparing Whitebeard to Kid may seem blasphemous at first, and that's because it is, but if we take away their strength and general awesomeness for just a second and only compare their narrative roles, there is somewhat of a strong similarity, in that they were one of the top rivals of the past and future Pirate King. Now, Whitebeard and Roger were basically neck and neck, and Luffy is definitely above Kid at this point, but don't forget that Kid did have the highest bounty of every rookie at Sabaody. He was always framed as a legitimate rival peer to Luffy, with Law helping round out the top 3 from this era basically. But Kid still needs a lot of work. Haki work in particular, and that's what could make Loki the perfect training partner for him, because it seems like giants are pretty good at using Haki, and potentially Conqueror's Haki, which we don't know for certain, but if not Elbaf, then where are we gonna learn it? I mean, one of the first grand showings of Haki's power was back in Little Garden, with Dory and Brogy attacking the giant goldfish, which they did a second time against Kid's ship, the Victoria Punk. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense for Elbaf to be the arc where we learn more about Conqueror's Haki in general, not even just for Kid, but even for the Strawhats. We learned advanced observation Haki in Whole Cake, we learned advanced armament in Wano with the Ryo lessons from Hyogoro, and while Luffy did unlock the ability to imbue Conquerors against Kaido, it wasn't necessarily explained, or it wasn't taught to him. Kaido even mentioned how Luffy's usage was sloppy early on, so there's probably a lot more to learn about how Conqueror's Haki works, which is something we've kind of already seen already with Shanks, who was coincidentally just seen at Elbaf fighting Kid. So I think Elbaf is where we're going to learn the ins and outs of Conqueror's Haki. I mean, what better place for that to happen than the land of the giants, where warriors apparently fight pretty much constantly, and where Shanks of all people seems to be connected to. And we know Shanks' Conqueror's Haki is among the best, if not the best in the verse, after seeing what he did against Green Bull, as well as what we learned from Film Red in Volume 4 Billion. I mean, he's able to use it to kill other people's observation Haki, and we've always wondered how people even cut wood off the Atom Tree to begin with, and if it is on Elbaf, then Conqueror's Haki may be the answer. And this could potentially explain why they're so good at using it. It's almost like a training tool, and maybe that all ties back to what I said earlier about the tree never falling despite how big the wars got. Again, this tree is acting somewhat as a source of some of their problems by helping them be as strong as they really are. I wouldn't even be surprised if we find out Shanks is tied to the trading of the Atom Wood as well. There's a lot we still need to learn about how the underworld and its underground trade system they have works, and since Shanks is tied to Elbaf so closely, I wouldn't be surprised if he's connected to it, especially since his captain and his protege's ships are made from that wood. He probably knows exactly how important it is, and I bet the Red Force is probably made of it as well, and that may be a reason why he continues to protect the island, as well as his connections to the giants, of course. Unfortunately though, I doubt Shanks will be present in the Elbaf arc, since he recently said he wants to go claim the One Piece, and it might be another little while till the crew makes landfall at Elbaf anyway, but I'm sure his influence will still be felt during the arc. I can see Shanks being to Elbaf almost like what Ace was to Wano, but probably even more involved. We might even learn a little about his history through the giants, and it could be a perfect setup for the eventual meeting between him and Luffy right at or before Laugh Tale or something. But to tie this whole Conqueror's Haki discussion back to Kid, the thing is that despite him having all 3 types of Haki, we've never seen him use a single one. Now, Kaido himself confirmed Kid did have Conquerors, but clearly Kid just hasn't developed it. He didn't even know Kaido could be hurt by Haki until Luffy did so on the roof, and Kaido once said that only Haki can transcend all. When Kid and Law beat Big Mom, it was mostly by taking their fruit powers as far as they would go, so he needs to have a chance to improve his Haki if he wants a chance, and that's probably what Loki is for, because Kid just needs to face reality. We need a character moment from him where he's at rock bottom, where he realizes he's not strong enough and it almost cost him and his crew's lives. We need to see him like Luffy was in Sabaody, or like he was after Marineford, just distraught and vulnerable, and he needs to realize that Haki is one of the root causes of that. He's like a guard in the NBA who can't shoot threes or something. You can't stay on the court if you suck at something that essential to the game. Even in the Udon prison, we saw that he was about as physically strong as Luffy, but then he dipped right before the Haki lesson started with Hyogoro, because the other thing Kid sucks at is gaining allies, which is Luffy's greatest trait according to Mihawk. Luffy inherently excels at arguably the top 2 things that can take you the furthest in the One Piece world, while Kid sucks at both of them. He's constantly trying to start a fight, and the only reason his bounty was the highest at Sabaody is because of what he did to innocent people. So him meeting Loki and even befriending him could offer 2 kinds of distinctive paths for growth for Kid, because let's face it, Kid's crew has been about as pathetic as he has. Killer is great, but Heat, Wire, and the gang just aren't it. They couldn't give up those road poneglyph rubbings fast enough whenever Shanks pulled up, so Kid just needs upgrades across the board, and I think Loki's just just the perfect person for that. And if Loki's talked to Saul at all, then that could provide Kid with some important information regarding the past or the poneglyphs, since Saul has some information from O'Hara. And now maybe you've been wondering, how is Kid even going to get saved from the ocean that he's drowning in right now? Well, in Norse mythology, there's a story where Loki created the first ever fishing net, and he used it to catch some fish. But there were people out there trying to capture him, so when they found Loki, Loki then burned the net and transformed into a salmon. But those who were chasing him were able to recreate the net, and they used it against Loki to fish him out of the water. I think Oda could flip this story on its head a little bit and have Loki fish Kid out of the water using a net before any of the other giants near the shore find him. I mean, even if Loki is different than most Elbaf giants, he's still gonna be a part of the Elbaf royalty. And Loki is 63 years old. It's not like he's an 8-year-old like Momo. So I'm pretty sure he's gonna be a very powerful and influential character whenever we meet him, and someone who's probably proficient in Haki. His partnership with Eustass Kid could provide one of the main antagonistic forces during this arc, although there probably will be several. And one of them will have to be Big Mom herself. Now look, right now she's kind of missing in action after that volcanic explosion under Wano from her fight with Law and Kid, but she has so much history here that it's almost impossible to see her not being involved. As I've said many times already, she's basically public enemy number 1 for the Giants. Her name is barely even spoken of on the island, and a lot of that started because of her rage on Elbaf during the fast for the Winter Solstice Festival, which has its own direct ties to Norse culture because the food Big Mom wanted that entire time was semla. This is something traditionally eaten before Lent in mainly Sweden, but other Nordic countries as well, on Fat Tuesday, or Fettistag. Forgive me for my pronunciations in this section, but semla is also a derivative of a German word, which could tie to Mother Carmel, who used the German word Geburtstag, which means birthday, for her attack that created Pandora. Oda probably used birthday because this is the day Pandora was created, but it could also be a cheeky nod to Linlin's birthday, which was shortly after this event, where Mother Carmel seemingly got eaten by Big Mom. I think this whole flashback is also pretty clearly a very, very small microcosm of Ragnarok from Norse mythology, because everything got burnt down and then afterward a new sun appeared, which is a pretty common storyline in most Ragnarok renditions. Mother Carmel even said that it was the sun god who saved them, which should sound alarm bells for all sorts of reasons, and I think that mainly this event is a precursor to a true Ragnarok that the Giants will experience in the future, sometime after our crew gets there. So that leads us back to Big Mom, who even as an adult has gone on several rages of her own. She even has a homie named Prometheus who is essentially exactly the same as Pandora. Even their faces are similar. I've kind of wondered if Prometheus is just Pandora before, but Big Mom did say Prometheus has some of her soul in it, so I doubt that's the case, but it's still fun to think about. Either way though, I think what happened in Elbaf with Big Mom back in the day is basically a foreshadowing of what she's going to do in the future. Burning down one village is what she did as a kid, maybe burning down the whole island, or at least trying to, is what she's going to do as an adult. I mean, if she was able to take down one of the Elbaf captains when she was just 5 or 6, then imagine what she can do to an entire island if she's an adult, especially if she finally awakens her devil fruit powers, which I don't think happened during Wano, by the way. But maybe how far she was pushed during or after that fight and the resulting volcanic explosion is enough to finally trigger that awakening. And I think the same thing might be happening for Kaido as well, but that's a whole separate thing. And this could mean that we would have one hell of a monster to deal with during the Elbaf arc, giving us one of the main antagonistic forces. But the layer here that I think is really funny is that if Kid does get a lot of credit from Loki or the other giants for defeating Big Mom, and then Big Mom pulls up, they're all gonna think he's a fraud. A lot of us kind of think he already is because Law put in so much work during that fight, but if Big Mom comes back and terrorizes Elbaf, then there was no reason for the giants to celebrate Kid in the first place. So maybe that would provide kind of a test for Kid, or some kind of motivation for him to actually get stronger and help the giants even more, to prove to them that he is strong enough to beat her, and maybe that also proves it to us fans. And if leading up to this, Kid was training with Loki and developing all sorts of Haki, maybe he would have a chance of fighting her, and proving to us fans as well that he isn't really a slouch. Now the issue with that to me is that this is Luffy's story, and he even promised to Katakuri that he would return and beat Big Mom one day. So I'm not sure if Kid would actually defeat Big Mom on his own during this arc. I mean, that alone sounds kind of crazy, but I think he would at least do enough and grow enough during the fight, which is the important thing, to prove he's actually getting somewhere since he did it without Law's help. I mean, him and Law had to work together to beat Big Mom without being awakened, so if awakened Big Mom shows up and in a hunger pang kind of mode and he's able to hold her off for a decent amount of time, that would still be really impressive, I think. And at this point, you may be thinking how we just got done fighting Big Mom. If she was an Elbaf, that would be the 3rd time that that she's been really relevant. Why does she need to be focused on and defeated again, etc, etc. But the thing is, it's already been a year and a half since we saw Big Mom in the manga and she lost a kid-in-law, and I don't think Big Mom would really appear in Elbaf until later in the arc, probably as some kind of sudden chaotic element after Oda gets other things set up. Given that it's also kind of hard to tell how much longer we'll be at Egghead before we even take off for Elbaf, it could be a total of 3 or 4 years between then and her defeat in Wano. So I think that's a pretty healthy amount of time to have her out of the story and then suddenly reappear. And keep in mind that this would also be a completely different Big Mom than what we saw in Wano probably. She'd probably be awakened at this point, probably in the middle of a rage, and really just at her absolute fiercest. This could even give us a better chance to learn how her powers really work and what really happened with Mother Carmel and the children. As I brought up a couple times by now, we probably all know the famous scene from her 6th birthday where she kind of ate everybody apparently, but only 2 people saw what really happened. One was Streusen, one of the most suspect characters in the entire story of One Piece, and an Elbaf giant who shared that news with the entire island, so all the giants know about it. We obviously are led to believe that this was cannibalism basically, so I wonder if Oda's gonna throw in some kind of interesting twist. Like, one idea from my friends Denden Kushi and 3 Day Trip involved the idea that Streusen actually turned everyone to food first, meaning Big Mom didn't really eat people, she ate food technically, but I'll leave a link to that video down below. But one of the oldest theories that I can personally remember is that Mother Carmel is still alive in her in some kind of way, potentially influencing her actions to this very day. And maybe that has something to do with the amnesia from Wano. I understand that plotline was iffy to a lot of people, and understandably so, but maybe Oda set that up specifically for whatever he's cooking during Elbaf. I mean, where else is that kind of information going to get revealed anyway? Because every giant knows what actually happened, and they were friendly with Mother Carmel. I don't have a surefire theory on what will happen here, but I just know Elbaf is where we're going to learn more about it. But the thing is, Big Mom has gripes with Kid, Luffy, and the Elbaf giants, kinda equally so. So I can see her rampaging and destroying basically everything in sight once she gets there, just like she did during Whole Cake while looking for the wedding cake. The giants of Elbaf may be fighting each other most of the time on their island, but after seeing what Big Mom did as a child at Elbaf, she would probably bring a true Ragnarok feel to the arc itself. And like I said at the beginning, Frankie said that despite all of the land's massive wars, the tree never fell, always offering a chance to rebuild. And this is where we need to dive into what Ragnarok really means and why the Adam tree falling almost has to coincide with that event. Because if Elbaf can always rebuild and continue on as long as the tree is there, which is basically what Frankie told us, then without it, they would basically have only one chance to make things work. So for Loki, Kid, or Big Mom, or anyone else to bring a true Ragnarok, or a true change to the Elbaf culture, then the Adam tree probably has to go. As I've alluded to throughout the video, Ragnarok and the final war will basically be synonymous in the world of One Piece. It's just the giants will call it by Ragnarok specifically. And the reason I've harped on this so much during the video is that in Norse mythology, Ragnarok is referenced over and over and over again. It's basically the apocalypse, or the end of days, where all the different realms and gods clash in a massive war. And while some stories of Ragnarok will differ from others, it's usually mentioned that the world burns or gets submerged, which might sound a little familiar after the old Mother Flame got into action. And after Ragnarok's over, most depictions say that a new sun rises at the end, almost like bringing a new dawn, which is something we've heard in One Piece oh so many times. So what better place for the final war to kick off than the place that prophesizes about the end of the world anyway? Elbaf seems to be a place that's also in war perpetually, so wouldn't it be ironic that what stops all the wars in Elbaf is what begins a war around the rest of the world? And that is why I think the Adam tree has to fall. Just like the tree of knowledge that fell in Ohara, like Giant Jack that fell in Skypiea and revealed the bell in the Poneglyph, the Adam tree will also have to fall in order to usher in a new era. And another reason for this that I'd like to hone in on is the Sunlight Tree Eve. We know this tree to be the one bringing sunlight to Fishman Island, more than 10,000 meters under the sea, and that's a beautiful juxtaposition to the Adam tree, which probably shoots all the way into the sky. I'm sure we're all familiar with the creation story of Adam and Eve by now, but it hits a lot harder when you consider all the other ties to Christianity that the government already has. Like their symbol is a cross, all of the celestial dragons have saint in their name, their holy land is called Mary-Joie, hinting at the Mother Mary potentially. So I think the story here is that the Adam tree needs to fall to mirror the Eve tree also falling. Well, we don't have a ton of information on it, but geographically speaking, it's probably inside the red line stretching all the way up to the top where Mary-Joie is. And I say this because Fishman Island is directly beneath Mary-Joie, Verges and the Red Line. So where else would that tree be going, really? Now, we don't know for sure, but that makes sense to me. And perhaps it stretches all the way up to Emu's flower room even. But the reason that this matters at all is because we already know Luffy's supposedly gonna destroy Fishman Island because of Shiarly's prophecy. And there are already tons of theories about destroying the Red Line as it is. And in doing so, the Sunlight Tree Eve would probably get destroyed as well. This could connect to how Dorian Broggie said that the serpent soaked in blood was the only thing that could withstand their attacks. Probably a nod to the Norse legend of the Jormungandr, one of Loki's children actually, but most people assume they were referring to the Red Line. Oda has kinda set up two different trees that the giants can't take down. One is the Eve tree, because it's probably covered by the Red Line, and then one's the Adam tree, which never fell despite all of their wars. There's a reason that Oda made these two Adam and Eve. Both trees are vital to two important allied countries, but for one reason or another, both will probably need to be destroyed in order to usher in a new era. Maybe it'll be Luffy, maybe it'll be Usopp, maybe it'll be Loki, Kid, or Big Mom. Whoever it is though, I think the Adam tree will fall during this arc, thus kicking off our final war. Adam and Eve were also believed to be the first ever humans, giving rise to the rest of us basically, and that also makes me think back to what Saturn said in chapter 1090, that no matter how low the humans' population dwindles, they can always multiply again. As long as you have an Adam and an Eve, you could say, you can basically regrow the population. So maybe by destroying both the Adam and Eve trees, that's a symbolic way of combating that mindset, and showing that it is time to usher in a new dawn. I mean, the Red Line is almost indestructible, and the Adam tree was so strong that Frankie and Tom built the Pirate King ships out of it, so seeing those two fall would truly be a sign that the final war is upon us, and to the giants, that Ragnarok is upon us. Especially if Uranus is on top of that tree. Like I said, Fishman Island and Wano both had ancient weapons, so Elbaf should have one as well. Especially since the arc before it was Egghead, where Vegapunk focuses on weather, Sky Island clouds, lasers, and even giant eggs. All things which people have at least loosely spoken about when theorizing on Uranus. I have a whole video connecting those things if you want to check that out after this, but the point is that this is the perfect place for Uranus to enter the story. And I think this is something that would happen at the very end of the arc, because that's what usually happens with ancient weapons. We didn't learn Shirahoshi was Poseidon until the end, we didn't know Pluton was in Wano until the end, so I bet we don't learn Uranus is there until the tree has already fallen, almost making things crazier and more hectic than they already were. That's why it's the perfect chance to kick off the final war, especially if you believe that Vivi is the one to control Uranus. I think that's the most likely scenario at this point because Emu wants to capture her. I've said this a few times now, but you're telling me Emu gets a hold of a sky weapon that is compared to an ancient weapon, and then directly afterward, after seeing that it works, Emu wants Vivi? Those things have to be connected. Yes, it could be because of Cobra, but we also know Emu was holding Vivi's poster a while ago. So what I'm thinking could be going on here is that Vivi does control Uranus, and once Emu got the replica version of Uranus that they can control themselves in the Mother Flame, they no longer want Vivi alive, so there's no competition basically. Imagine if Frankie had used the blueprints to make Pluton's counter without Pluton actually existing. The counter itself would then be the most dangerous thing. And I think that's basically the situation Emu's creating with Uranus and the Mother Flame by eliminating Vivi, or just capturing Vivi. Since ancient weapons, or the people that control them at least, however you want to phrase it, are reborn every so many centuries, there seems to be some kind of continuous cycle. So for Emu, the ancient weapons are almost always going to be some kind of threat, but at the same time, these are probably opportunities for Emu to get the ancient weapons on their side somehow. But now that Emu has a replica, being the Mother Flame, the best thing to do would be to remove the real Uranus from the chessboard entirely, and forever. If we believe that Vivi is Uranus, or controls it, whatever you want to call it, then Emu may want to capture Vivi at this point, so there's no concern for the real weapon to get involved. Maybe Emu could even give Vivi immortality, or freeze her in the freezer, or something that keeps her around permanently, so it stops that cycle of reincarnation so that Uranus is never an issue again. And if Elbaf is the island where we find Uranus, then it makes perfect sense for all that to be revealed there, and I can even see Uranus's powers being used in some way to save them. Like, remember at the end of Alabasta, Vivi yelled throughout the capital and then suddenly it began raining. It made it seem as if she did it, and controlling the weather is probably the #1 most commonly theorized ability for Uranus. So even if that situation in Alabasta was just because of the dance powder, maybe Oda can kind of recreate that in Elbaf with the real Uranus. Maybe when Adam falls, the island will be in chaos and burning down, but Vivi will be able to make it rain to put it all out. This could actually mimic the Mother Carmel scene a little bit, but inverted in two important ways. One would that it's someone who's truly good that's doing it, being Vivi instead of Mother Carmel, and also the fire would be put out with rain as opposed to the creation creation of a fake sun, which could have all of its own kind of implications. And I think ending Elbaf in this fashion would kind of mimic what we saw with Shirahoshi as well, where her powers were revealed at the very end as a way to save her country. Maybe Vivi is able to do the same thing in Elbaf. And now maybe some of you are kind of wondering at this point, how can I be so sure that Vivi is even going to be in Elbaf anyway? Well, other than the Amazon Lily / Elbaf parallels I made earlier, which could tie to Nefertari Lily, and the fact Vivi's being hunted and needs some kind of protection in the meantime, we also have to keep in mind that Vivi was literally there on Little Garden with our crew. She knows the crew wanted to visit Elbaf, and she saw how much they liked and befriended those giants. It makes sense for her to not only reappear in that arc, but be aware that our crew would be going there. She's with Morgans right now, who's kept close tabs on the Egghead situation, and Egghead isn't even that far from Elbaf, so I think she's going to put 2 and 2 together. I doubt she would want to go to Egghead right away because there's 30,000 Marines, an Admiral, and a Gorosei member there right now, so wading into that battlefield seems like a pretty bad decision personally. So maybe Vivi will order Morgans to take her to Elbaf instead because she suspects the crew will go there. Or maybe the crew just sees Morgan's ship in midair as they leave using the anti-gravity technology, and then they pick her up and use the Kude burst. Whatever it is, I think the crew is going to find Vivi right after Egghead is over and take her in so they can protect her. I mean, she just got captured by CP0 at the Reverie, her father was killed, and the one guy who saw it all happen is with her right now. She alone could be the reason our crew gets motivated to take on the government. They already like Cobra, they already like Vivi, and if Luffy finds out the people of Lelucia got along with Sabo, he's gonna be mad about that too. I think there's a pretty healthy debate going on right now about whether Laugh Tale will happen before the final war, or whether getting the One Piece will be the last thing we see in the story. Because even though the first idea might make more sense, Oda has alluded to the second idea. And I gave a good argument for the former in my last video, so let me give a good argument for the latter in this one, because genuinely I do think both are possible. The main logic behind going to Laugh Tale first is that it would give us the information necessary to take on the government, the truth of the world, the Void Century, the ancient weapons, and so forth. But Vivi may be able to supply that same motivation just by talking to them about what's already happened, especially if she gets captured by Emu afterward. Vivi arriving in Elbaf to create a plan with the crew could be a perfect parallel to whatever Lily did 800 years ago. Emu talked about a blunder from Lily that may be part of a bigger plan, and we could see something similar where Vivi creates a bigger plan and then fools Emu in the process by getting captured on purpose. I mean, regardless of where Vivi goes, she will have a target on her back, so her turning herself in could also be viewed as a big hero moment for her, because she doesn't want everyone else to get hurt in the process, so she gives herself up. If there's one thing we know about Vivi, it's that she always wants to stop the fighting, and she always wants peace. And in Alabasta, we even learned that she doesn't even want a single person to die, even in a huge civil war. So having her do something like this in Elbaf, where they seem to be fighting all the time, would be pretty fitting thematically. And I think this could all get a lot more interesting if we also find the man marked by flames at some point as well. Imagine Luffy has all 4 road poneglyph rubbings, but then Vivi gets captured, kind of forcing his hand to help his friend before accomplishing his dream, which I think he would definitely do. So if Vivi is able to convince them to buy into a plan to start a true final war, and then they go to Laugh Tale afterward, that would also let Vivi join them on the trip to Laugh Tale, which I think is pretty fitting because of the connections between Lily and Joy Boy 800 years ago, which we don't know all the details of just yet, but it would be kind of cool. But last but certainly not least, I want to hone in on our boy Usopp. As you certainly know by now, this is where he's supposedly meant to become a brave warrior of the sea. I've already mentioned how he could be an inversion of Loki to some degree, and potentially earn some respect from the giants through that connection. But becoming a brave warrior of the sea is a much harder concept to pin down than almost every other dream in the story. I mean, Luffy just needs to find the One Piece to accomplish his, Zoro needs to beat Mihawk, Robin needs to read the whole history, etc. But Usopp's is pretty loosely constructed comparatively. Brave warrior of the sea is basically an epithet. It's something that people would need to know Usopp by exclusively almost. I think it's akin to names like Sora, warrior of the sea, or maybe even Nolan the liar, both names of which came from picture books. And I think this is an idea that's become even more important with Luffy's Gear 5th powers since it ties to imagination and freedom, where even Kaido said it's like something out of a picture book. One Piece has stories that are passed down in the One Piece world just like stories in our world, and that's how people become known by their epithets so widely, sometimes at least. And in fact, the Elbaf giants connect to books pretty closely because of Ohara, where they recovered as many as they could from the lake after the Buster Call. They know how important history is. Saul isn't even a fan of the Elbaf giants, but he still worked with them after the Ohara incident, which could be a hint that perhaps they're on the same page at least in this one important way. So when it comes to Usopp, he will need to do something to earn that kind of notoriety to be remembered the way he wants. as a brave warrior of the sea. My friend Hidden Island has an amazing video that dives into this idea much deeper, and it's literally one of my favorite One Piece videos on YouTube. It's pretty much exactly what I think is going to happen with Usopp, so you should definitely go check it out after this. Or if you want to keep hearing about Ragnarok, go check out this video from my friend Kev DOG. But also remember to join the Pro-Nap movement and enjoy 10% off your first order on the mantasleep website using my discount code below. But that's it for this video, so please make sure to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And YouTube also told me that you may like one of these two videos on the screen right here. Later.